and welcome to the Bharat Vartha podcast. Now, we've seen a spate of startup funding activity in recent times. Just in the last couple of weeks alone, we have seen fintech startup Grow, which raised about $83 million in Series D funding from Tiger. Gupshup raised about 100 million from Tiger again. ShareChat raised around 500 million from Tiger too. Meesho raised 300 million from SoftBank. E-pharmacy startup PharmEasy raised about 350 million. Cred raised 200 plus million from Falcon Edge and so on. Just this year alone, we've had 10 unicorns being minted, and we're only in April right now. And aside from this, a bunch of mature startups like Zomato and Policy Bazaar and Delivery have raised large rounds ahead of their proposed IPO this year. So to make sense of all of this, we have two very special guests on the podcast today. Making his debut on Bharat Vartha, we have my friend Nimish Joshi. Nimish is Executive Vice President and Head of Strategy and Business Development at Star TV. Nimish has experience of over 17 years across financial services, public and private markets, internet and digital media sectors. Before Star TV, Nimish was Chief Strategy Officer at Ola, where he led over $2 billion of capital raise in equity and debt. He also incubated the Ola Electric business, which has been in the news recently, and which is by itself a unicorn right now. Nimish has also been the #1 ranked equity analyst at CSLA, covering technology and internet sectors. Welcome, Nimish.
Thank you, Roshan, for having me on the Bharat Vartha podcast.
All right, and joining us in conversation also is another friend and guest extraordinaire. Rajiv Mantri is the managing director at Navam Capital. Rajiv is also director at GPSK Investment Group, a proprietary trading and investment management firm active in India's financial markets. Prior to founding Navam Capital, Rajiv worked at New York-based venture capital firm Lux Capital that focused on investments in energy, water, and advanced materials. Rajiv has also been a columnist on technology, venture capital, and entrepreneurship in India for Mint, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and a bunch of other newspapers and magazines. He's also the best-selling co-author of A New Idea of India, which we have discussed multiple times earlier on the podcast. Thank you for being with us, Rajiv.
Thank you, Roshan. Nice to be with you again.
All right, so plenty of exciting topics to cover, plenty of ground to cover actually in this podcast. Maybe we can begin with some opening comments. Rajiv, you just heard a long litany of fundraise announcements, right, that have happened. So what are we seeing right now?
So many of the companies you mentioned, Roshan, were actually obviously early stage companies, right? If you go back 4 or 5 years, these were the companies in that sort of fundraising burst in 2014, 15, 16. These were some of the companies raising A and B rounds. And what is interesting to see is obviously 5 years later, here they are able to justify larger rounds of capital, raising growth equity. Clearly, they've obviously built a business of some size and scale in the last 4-5 years. And the big change, like we've also talked about in an early episode, has been the entrance of Jio, right? So that has transformed the Indian telecom space, the mobile internet space, and created space for all these new ventures and businesses to be built on top of low cost data and pretty much ubiquitous connectivity. So I still see this as the early innings of what is to come in India. There's going to be much more of this in India. There'll be many more unicorns and many more sort of wealth creation stories coming out in the next few years.
Fantastic. Yeah, so Nimish, your comments as well. I mean, as Rajiv mentioned, a lot of headroom for growth, and also these businesses seem to have been born at a time when funding was not as prevalent as now. It was kind of scarce, right? So battle tested in some sense, right? So what are your thoughts?
I think, basically, having been a part of the journey at Ola, before that at InMobi, clearly, I guess I would classify these as maybe third stage of evolution of Indian companies. And I'm not taking into consideration the very first stage, which was the late 90s, early 2000s with Make My Trip and Naukri. And probably a lot of your viewers might probably not even born back then. But I would say if I were to take the first stage, would be the likes of Flipkart, Ola, Snapdeal, and they hit, I won't say peak valuations, but very high valuations back in 2015 when we saw such a flood of capital into Indian private market space. So that was one, I would say, one cohort of companies. The second cohort of companies would be the likes of Swiggy and Zomato, which were very early companies, young companies back then, 2015, and but they've seen a big chunk in valuation. This, I would say, is the third wave, and a bunch of names that you took trying to solve interesting problems. But at the same time, the overall liquidity surge globally, and this is not a phenomenon restricted to India, right? And I feel pegging ourselves and feeling happy about unicorn valuations itself is probably pegging ourselves too low. Just the sheer potential of the Indian market and the innovations and the adventurousness of these entrepreneurs, we should be targeting not $1 billion, but a 10 billion, $15 billion valuation companies. And I would see over the next 5 years, a lot of these companies graduate into that stage. So yes, it is something to stop and feel happy about, but a lot more needs to be covered. I guess I was reading this report which talked about some 40, 50 unicorns, and maybe 10 have been added to the list since in the last month or so. But I would be extremely surprised if that number doesn't hit, say, 250 in the next 4 or 5 years. So yes, good trajectory, new companies coming, solving very unique India, it's important Indian problems. So a lot of the other trend which I see is earlier, if you see Ola, a Flipkart, parallels to those existed in the West or China to an extent. Some of these latest bunch of unicorns, I would say, are also where they are completely Indian, solving Indian problems. So it's, I would also see this as a recognition of India's uniqueness more and more by these global investors. So yeah, a long way ahead, but I would say it's a good start, especially 1 year back when things looked so all downright gloomy.
Yeah. No, it's a great point you bring up, which is uniquely Indian businesses, right? And Khata Book comes to mind actually, right? Very very uniquely Indian problem, and also solving a problem which people tended to stay away from, right? Selling software to Indian MSMEs, right? Very few have done that well in the past, right? And also the fact that there's a lot of headroom for growth, right? ShareChat, even though it's at about I think 200 or 300 million users, can add another couple of hundred users, couple of 100 million users easily. And this has been possible because of the geo revolution of adding those 300 400 million users, right? We've talked about that on an earlier episode with Rajiv. Very interesting in terms of how that will change the landscape and so on. Rajiv, Nimish mentioned the 3 stages of startups. There are, in fact, startups that go back even further, right? Take Zomato, for example. They've been around for about 12, 13 years now, right? They're poised to IPO this year. And similarly, there is the likes of Policy Bazaar and Delivery as well, which are all about 10-year plus. And they've kind of raised a bunch of money recently in Series D or later stage rounds, right? So what are your thoughts about these guys?
So actually, if you look at the cohort, there's even some relatively recently founded businesses, right? So a company like Meesho, I think even Grow. So these are 3-4 year old companies, and they too have scaled fast enough where some people think that they are this valuable. Some funds think they are this valuable, and that just goes to show the headroom that we're talking about, Roshan. That if you look at a business like Grow, for example, in financial services, so India is so under-penetrated, and these companies can grow 10, 20 times, 50 times from where they are, and there would still be a runway for them to grow. So I think it's actually quite difficult to compare the older businesses with the newer ones, because the older ones were, some of them like Gupshup actually have pivoted couple of times. Gupshup had actually started, like, a lot of people probably don't remember, even Twitter, when it was founded, there was no mobile internet as such, right? There were no smartphones when Twitter was founded. So people exchanged SMSs. You posted Twitter through an SMS, and Gupshup was kind of like a clone of that. in a sense. It was founded like probably almost 15 years ago now. And over the years, Gupshup has pivoted to more of a B2B kind of approach. And it's very different from what obviously they started out as, because just the entire landscape has shifted so much. So
Right.
there are all kinds of businesses in there. Some of them have started with something, went to some other direction 5 years later, and 5 more years later here they are. And there are those who are just 3-4 years old and just hit the right sort of product market fit, the right formula in India, just as the Geo wave was taking off, and they've hit that valuation benchmark in a very short time.
Right. Yeah, Gupshup is certainly surprising, right? I mean, I think I remember those auto rickshaw ads.
Talking about this business actually.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sort of, I've been sort of in India now for a decade plus, and I remember Gupshup from back in the day.
Right.
I'd kind of forgotten that this business was there at that time, and reading about them was nice to see that they've done this.
Yeah. No, I had the exact same feeling. My memories of them were the auto rickshaw ads, right? And I think as you rightly said, I mean, they started off as SMS for group SMS for
group
consumers. Then they pivoted to selling to businesses, right? They worked with the likes of HDFC and some of the airlines as well. And today they offer that WhatsApp business basically, right? And just to see how they've pivoted once, twice, thrice over the last 15 years is fantastic. Even yeah.
It's also it shows something, right? So Gupshup started as a Twitter clone, now to somewhere else, and now there are other Twitter clones which are also maybe heading towards unicorn valuation,
Right.
the likes of Poo and
Yeah, it's amazing actually. I mean, even Zomato, right? At the time they were founded, I mean, how many listings businesses fell by the wayside, but they were able to sustain themselves, grow globally, right? Across Africa, Middle East as well, and have been able to pivot into delivery, even though and do well at delivery, even though they were late to that sector, right? So Nimish. What is the exit for some of these investors who are coming in at this point of time? And also, if you could talk about, the IPO process itself.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I guess for the longest, the issue for a lot of investors investing in India has been what's the exit? How do I exit? We haven't really seen any significant IPOs so far. I mean, Make My Trip, maybe more recently Nazara, Ease My Trip, smaller ones. And the biggest exit definitely remains Flipkart, where Walmart bought it out. Well, that really brought India more and more on the global, in the eyes and minds of other global investors, because they said, okay, there's a real market, so we have exits. So by and large, so far, if you were to look at a trend, I guess it's been secondary exits for early investors. You've seen that in Oyo, you've seen Lightspeed and Sequoia got good exit. You've seen probably more recently in ShareChat, you mentioned, where some of the early investors have exited. Dream11. So yes, compared to 3 years back, when it was seen as if early investors are exiting, sort of the new incoming investors used to balk at that and say, oh, is there a problem that they are exiting? But it's just a question of what stage you invest and what stage you exit. I think that has become much more acceptable. As a result of that, you've seen a lot of secondary exits for early investors, which is why early investing has picked up. You have seen a lot of exits for employees as well through ESOPs being bought out. So overall, I would say this stocks or shares of companies, private companies, have become more valuable, and it is seen as real money instead of just paper money to an extent. And now you spoke about IPOs. Yes, if Nykaa, Policybazaar, Delivery, Zomato, these names are being bandied around right now. If some of these indeed go IPO through this year, I would say that will be a big shot in the arm. And in fact, I would see more risk-taking ability by not just foreign investors, but also Indian investors. Indian investors have been pretty much absent completely in the early stage or even in early growth stage in the startups, in the private investment space. I would expect them to come and probably invest more. So that is definitely one upshot that I will see of IPOs happening. And yes, I think more than the process, Roshan, I think it's been the way Indian public markets have been. Indian public markets have always treated profit, and that's the way it should be. Please make no mistake that they have valued profit a lot more. They've been a bit more conservative relatively. And unlike in the US or even in China, where investors have shown extremely more risk appetite to invest in loss-making businesses. And I think that attitude is changing. Even in India, it was not just profit making. Everyone expected a profit above a certain threshold, say maybe 100 crores and above. And in the last 2 years itself, you've seen at least 10, 12, 15 companies with less than 100 crore annual profit, which have gone public. So that I think has been one fundamental change in the investor mindset. Which has probably emboldened the likes of Zomato and all to consider Indian listings. That is one. Second, I feel on the IPO process itself, I remember I was talking to someone in the finance ministry a few months back, and he was telling me that 70 to 80% of finance ministry's compliances come from SEBI. And mind you, the entire income tax act falls under finance ministry. There is some way on the RBI side, there is a banking and financial regulation. And you can imagine 70% of compliance is coming from SEBI. So clearly there is over compliance happening at SEBI. That is reflected in the IPO process. They tried to tinker around trying to facilitate, but I guess somewhere down the line, it hasn't been enough. And I think it will need a one full entire episode to really cover what all SEBI needs to do to really ease this process. But I think a lot needs to be done there. So I must admit that anyone who goes IPO, any company goes IPO right now is going there despite the SEBI regulations, not because of facilitation by any changes or any forward looking. And I think that's one thing that the Indian policymakers need to look at. A very thriving IPO market, which will really help improve the early stage market in India as well. And I think that creates more entrepreneurs, right? More entrepreneurs means more jobs. I think that chain reaction is well known. I need not harp on that. But I think so. A lot of things need to be done on the regulatory side. A lot of positives will happen if the IPOs invariably end up happening.
Yeah, so I'm actually reminded of this tweet that Piyush Gupta of Sequoia India had tweeted some time back. He said, startups have two ways to run the IPO process. Number one, onboard the banks, auditors, 3-4 legal firms, PR, IR advisors, prepare 3-year audits, industry report, financial systems upgrade, 5-year model, and all of that stuff, right? Including making key hires and everything. And number two, do this prep work way before starting the IPO circus, right?
Yes, I think Piyush is a good friend actually. One point probably I got missed out is the whole SPAC thing is completely short-circuited this process, not in India, but elsewhere. And I'm seeing, right, because when I was at Ola, Grab was a small company and it is IPOing at $40 billion. So some of these regulatory unlocks can create disproportionate value. Just the whole process of making it easy for a company to go IPO can literally unlock thousands of crores of value in for people, but also in taxes for the government in a way, because people sell, buy, exchanges. So I guess definitely it's a process, and the process was there for a right. I would say because the regulators cared a lot about retail investors not being fleeced, and that's why this whole big disclosures. But I think over time, with so much information available about everything in the market, in the public domain, I think the importance of some of those processes, regulations has gone down, which is why I'm saying US has been progressive about it, right? SPACs, they're allowing, it's a process towards that. So I think India should also consider that. I know there are some tax implications on SPACing Indian headquartered companies, but in a way, what will happen is if you remove those tax implications, maybe more companies might go abroad and IPO, and you don't want to prevent flight of that. But companies might do that even anyway. Every incremental company will start incorporating in Singapore. So it's a balance that we need to play out.
Right. I'd love for your thoughts on this, Rajiv, because I feel like some of these regulation compliance is built for a sort of a pre IP led innovation, pre technology world, right? So, what are some things that you would advise as prescriptions to make this little more amenable for all of the tech startups looking to IPO right now?
No, so actually, see, there is a balance between investor protection and capital access for companies, right? So what India has done, I think, is gone too far to protect the last sort of marginal investor. So I think if any regulator takes the position that we want to operate on a zero sort of zero defect kind of zero investor, there should be zero defect in zero failure in investor protection, then you will end up with some very very kind of cumbersome IPO regulations, I think, which is what we have in India, and which is what has been driving number of these things, like you mentioned, like incorporating abroad because of listing barriers here. I think what needs to be done is there needs to be a balance. Nowadays it is not so difficult, or rather it is put differently, rather it is not easy to sort of do some kind of a funny activity in the financial markets. It was much easier earlier when there was no media, or there was limited media, there was limited business and financial media. If you go back 25 years and you compare the landscape, what was there then and what is there today? Nowadays there are very popular social media handles which are digging up all kinds of information and in fact triggering off havoc in certain stocks, right? So these are like intrepid independent analysts, digital media websites who are publishing content, who are analyzing companies, and the market for information has expanded so much that it is that much more difficult for a company to sort of hide stuff or do something out of line, and there is a cost for doing something out of line. Earlier you could do that and maybe cover it up somehow, right? Like there are maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 editors or properties that would cover the news like that, and somehow you manage to sort of get them to look the other way and your job is done. But nowadays that's much more harder. I mean, all the filings are available online. Like anyone with a phone or a computer can download like entire historical data and corporate filings from the exchange websites. So I think we underestimate how much all of this matters, because if you go back 20 years, 15 years, people didn't have access to all this. So that's all the more reason actually to have a more liberal regime. And frankly, even Indian investors have evolved, right? So if you look at the quantum of investment that's going into markets now through systematic investment plan, through mutual funds, even in other avenues, so the exposure of the Indian household has increased, and thus people are more aware as to what the stock market is, and they are not investors of the 1990s or the 1980s, that we need to hold on to this attitude that they don't know what they're doing and let's protect them at all cost. In fact, why in the public market, I think the regulators are also holding on to this in the alternative investment side, where we have pushed up the net worth requirements to start a PMS or an AIF. You have made the ticket size also 50 lakhs for a PMS, 1 crore for an AIF. So that, in my view, is a little restrictive. And net worth also is like essentially an artificial barrier to entry. So there is a case to sort of lower that. And generally, I think equity capital markets in India, on the side of capital deployers, capital providers, and pooling sort of fund pools, there is a case to sort of make it easier to do that rather than harder.
Right, absolutely, and yeah, you're right as well. I mean, we've seen record number of investors come into the equity markets last year, right? And if we just look at all of the IPOs, I mean, all of them consistently oversubscribed, right? Yeah, and
so even companies like Upstocks, the Tiger Global backed brokerage, Upstocks, Zerodha,
yeah,
which is sort of 100% sort of owned by the founders and this that. You see the growth trajectories in the last like year and a half. And this is actually to the credit of the government. as well, because if you a few people noticed, talked about it when it happened, but I think it was in 2016 or 2017 that the Modi government had actually made the EPFO a buyer in the Indian stock market. So EPFO has been consistently buying equities for the last 4-5 years now. And before that, EPFO had no exposure to equities.
Right. Yeah, and that particular segment, especially, right? I mean, if you've seen the brokerages segment, I mean, it's no longer the Motilal Oswals or the HDFCs or the ICICI who are leading it, right?
Yeah.
It's
So
completely inverted. So you have Zerodha, Grow, Upstocks.
There's been a widening institutional participation
Yeah.
from the likes of EPFO and obviously all the insurers and others. There's been widening retail participation from so many sort of first-time investors that are coming into the Indian market. And then obviously there are information utilities, right? So all the content creators, digital websites, digital media properties we're talking about. So all of this put together means that the landscape is transformed. So why hold on to those dated regulations? There is a case for change.
Right. So, Nimish, we are seeing plenty of this growth stage capital find its way to India, right? So, Tiger is almost saying Tiger Zinda hai, right? Sorry, that's a bad joke. But, with all of the investments that are happening, and then, of course, there is the legendary SoftBank as well, which recently declared 30 billion in profits in the March quarter itself, right? And then we have Leaf Excel's new fund Addition and others like Falcon Edge and so on, right? So, why are these guys so keen about India and why are they investing in India?
I think basically probably more is being written about many of them now, but it's not that maybe, and of course all of them are deploying bigger checks right now. But I think many of the names that you mentioned have been believers in India, in Indian story, even before the Indians were believers. So I would consider if there's one person who has had significant impact, positive impact on the Indian private market startups is Leaf Excel. He was literally like a third co-founder at Flipkart. The early checks he wrote, because see, he changed the balance of power from the VCs towards the founders. It became a seller's market rather than a buyer's market from a capital perspective. And he did it back in 2012-13. He used to cut 5 million checks over after a couple of phone calls, while the VCs at that time took 2 months due diligence. This took cut a 2-3 million check. He gave a valuation which founders wanted rather than negotiating for the last bit. So I think Tiger, and you've seen the success, right? Myntra acquired by Flipkart. Flipkart itself, he had deployed $1 billion of capital. Ola and a bunch of those. They went quiet for a bit and they are back. SoftBank again, the first biggest check ever written in Indian startup ecosystem was SoftBank to InMobi, 2011. So Nauroz Udvadia has, through Falcon Edge, has been an investor in the Indian ecosystem. Obviously, all of them have increased check sizes, and that's a couple of things. One, because they have been able to convince more and more of their LPs or limited partners that these kind of check sizes can be deployed in India and you will get good returns. They have demonstrated good returns in the past. So SoftBank had a good exit in Flipkart. It was a quick one. Tiger has had a few good exits. Falcon Edge has done well with multiple companies, and which is why their LPs have the confidence for this kind of checks to be deployed. It's literally, if you see, the SoftBank, Tiger is now deploying 100 million checks. With that same frequency, they were deploying maybe 15-20 million checks 7-8 years back. So yeah. It's 5-6x. It's grown. So I think they have been believers. One, they've changed the ecosystem, the financing ecosystem totally. So it's not new for them. It's just that they have greater pools of capital. Tiger has raised a $7 billion fund. So even if they were to deploy 100 million checks, they will need 60-70 such investments across. That's one. Second, I also feel some of the things, it's not talked about much, but some of the things happening in China with the Tencent and Alibaba could be potentially structural derating events for all internet companies in China potentially, because the way the regulations have moved. See, just like when the whole Vodafone tax thing happened in India, it could have been a derating event for the entire Indian telecom industry and in general. I think similarly, what's happening in China is potentially a derating event for Chinese internet, and there is a lot of capital. Where do you deploy? You deploy in India. That's the one big market. So I think in a way, India probably is also benefiting from that. And this is despite the fact that the Chinese investors themselves have been absent. They were pretty much active in India from 2015-16 to 2018 when Tiger was absent. SoftBank was doing select checks, but they are obvious they are taking it slow for obvious reasons in India right now. But so I don't think this optimism of these 4 or 5 investors you mentioned is new. It's just that bigger ticket sizes they are cutting, and besides that, everyone else has been emboldened. You have a Coatue investment investing, Ripit Capital investing a lot in fintech. So yes, the pool of investors has definitely widened for late stage investing. And I would give disproportionate credit to Leaf Excel for sort of making this process friction free over the last 6-7 years.
Right. Yeah, there's a fantastic article by this guy called Everett Randall from the Founders Fund called Playing Different Games. And he contrasts basically Tiger's approach to growth investing versus some of the others, right? And there he specifically talks about the frequency of investment and the turnaround times being so low, as you rightly mentioned, right? So, but just to push back, right? A lot of this is also hope capital, right? Because as you've seen and as we've discussed as well, there's been one major exit for these growth stage investors before, which is the Flipkart Walmart deal. And the IPO process, as we previously spoke about, is fairly complex. Now, even then, they seem to have this conviction in India, right? Which is also because the non-China world is pretty limited in that sense as well. So again, thoughts from both of you, Rajiv and Nimish. Maybe we can begin with Rajiv in terms of how these guys will make these investments work.
So, Roshan, let's talk about what has changed, right? Since Walmart acquired a controlling stake in Flipkart, what has really changed? So, in the last 3-4 years, obviously, like we discussed, there's been a much deeper penetration of mobile internet. Now, what has also happened the last year has been home broadband has also really taken off. I think it's up like 5-6x. Again, thanks to JioFiber. So that's the first thing. Second thing is India itself is changing regulations to some degree. So it's not been announced yet. We don't know the exact contours of it, exact picture yet. But India has said that it will be permitting Indian registered companies to list internationally. So you could have a Indian company, that's registered here in India, and you could list it on notified, specified exchanges, which would include like exchanges in the US, the UK, and a few other countries, which sort of comply with some of the global, I think, money laundering and other kind of best practices. So that is the other change. So then that really opens the field, because you could have an Indian business registered in India that can be listed on the New York Stock Exchange or the LSE or the Singapore Stock Exchange, wherever. Those three or 5 countries which will be permitted to do that. So then that aspect of what happens next and who sort of provides the next round of financing, that becomes much easier when you're able to access global liquid capital like that through an exchange listing. So I think both those factors together have really changed the picture. And we've all seen in the last 1 year the whole wave of digitalization, the whole wave of everything sort of that can be shifted online. People have tried to shift it online in the last 12 months, right? So and there are good reasons to do that, even in a let's say a non-pandemic sense, right? Just for sheer reasons of productivity. Some things just work better when you kind of digitize it, when you use software and so on. And even the government wants that. It makes when businesses formalize, when businesses sort of do things in a way that's kind of electronically traceable, then obviously administration, tax administration, and regulation all become much easier. So I think for all these reasons put together, exits in the future will not be that difficult. I think many of us, who've been around for, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years, are kind of scarred by the old experiences, right? We feel like the future will continue to be difficult and like the past. But I think it is time for a genuine kind of mental shift. The world is changing, and it's not going to be that challenging anymore, in my view. Obviously, a business still has to perform well. Business has to sort of deliver well in terms of earnings, in terms of top line growth, in terms of the market opportunity and all those things. But I don't see these barriers kind of constraining Indian business to the same extent.
Right. Nimish, again, your thoughts as well. And the funding, seems to be agnostic across sectors, right? So we had the first health tech unicorn, the first social commerce unicorn, the first infrastructure technology unicorn, the first e-pharmacy unicorn, and so on. So unlike earlier, where, for example, let's say, it was cornered by e-commerce or consumer internet companies majorly, right? So we are seeing this across sectors, which again, is a conviction in the India story, right? So yeah, your thoughts.
I think there are two things, Roshan. I mean, as you rightly pointed out, I feel obviously it's somewhat indiscriminate spraying of capital, I would admit, but at the same time, I would say 7 out of 10 such these investments have happened in market leaders in that particular space. So it's not like 5 companies in a particular space are sort of getting that kind of capital. So clearly, so if I were to take the first filtering level itself, the automatic filtering is market leader. So the probability of that company faring well financially, earning profits, growing, there's a demonstrated track record. First level of filtering is already done. So the probability of that some of these companies succeeding is much higher. That is one purely, I think I'm just talking about the investment thesis which some of these investors are probably using. Secondly, I guess, see, in general, over the last 6-7 years, there's greater belief, and the more and more I talk to some of these investors, they seem to have a lot more conviction in the current dispensation in the country, and they believe it's and because they have a global view, right? They invest across countries, they see the overall governance frameworks, governance standards globally, and these investors seem to have disproportionate belief in the Indian governance, the current government, that they will deliver, that yes, there are issues. So some of the things which Rajiv mentioned and even I spoke of, there is greater belief that those unlocks will happen. So they're not worried about that being a constraint to future exits. That's two. Third, I guess there's been one fundamental shift which had kept a lot of investors away and which was probably a barrier to P's or valuations in public markets, which is why only IT companies and consumer companies at one point got high P's and others got low, was the standard of governance within companies. The old style, I would say Bania would be a wrong. I have a lot of respect for Banias, but more Lala mentality in terms of a lot of listed companies used to just steal money through capex and rather than focus on valuation. This new breed of entrepreneurs understand the value evaluation. So at moment that happens, there's clean governance, automatically valuations tend to go up. And fourth, again, as I mentioned a bit earlier, it's being compared what's happening elsewhere. US is of course there, but in China and all, compared to that, they feel maybe the regulatory risk is much lower. So it's a basically confluence of these 4 or 5 factors which has given these investors the confidence to deploy capital with a hope and belief that there will be decent exit, say 4 or 5, and these have longer. What happened? The cost of capital has become less. All these funds have demonstrated track records, so no LPs are asking them what return my capital in 4 years. So if instead of 5 it goes to 7 years or 8, I think they have sufficient ability to withstand that and this. So I think all these factors have contributed to this kind of capital frenzy and confidence that there will be good returns on this capital deployment. Now, it remains to be seen how it pans out, but having been a part of the ecosystem, I am hopeful that it should be a good outcome for most of these investors.
Right. And while in India terms, I mean, it might be significant money. In world terms, it is still, just to put things in perspective, the overall, I think VC market was about $300 billion in 2020, right? Of which around 50% was cornered by the US, around 146 billion. And India has attracted about 11.5 billion, right? So it's about less than 4%, right? That's really what we're talking about. And so this will also enable companies to go out and build truly large businesses, right? And I mean, enable founders rather, because I mean, earlier, if you look at the earlier bunch of folks, like for example, Redbus is one thing that comes to mind very immediately, right? Great business, but got sold for something like 110 million or something around then, right? So you're going to see people go beyond this 100 to 500 million mark and build truly big businesses, I feel, right? So
I
Rajiv,
think question, I think just sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
felt what's important if you look at it, right? I mean, some of the businesses, the way I see digitization itself, as Rajiv spoke about, is unlocking huge opportunities. So if you
Yeah.
look at it before, what is the biggest retail business in India? Rajiv, I mean, I don't even know, probably, but not even maybe $10 billion market cap. Whereas Walmart was whatever
Yeah,
this,
so by market cap, that would be DMart.
yeah, now,
Yeah.
yeah. So I
But
think,
you're right, Nimish. If you look at the number of stores
Yeah.
DMart has, they could build 10x the number of stores in India fairly
Yeah.
easily.
yes.
So while someone can argue that it is richly valued and so on,
Hmm.
their headroom is very, very large, and that's offline. And obviously online, we have Amazon, there is Walmart, Flipkart,
Right.
there is JioMart.
The point I was trying to make there essentially was, you see, it was impossible to build an education business which will be worth $10 billion offline because it had restrictions. Now online it's possible. So whenever
and
someone,
fragmentation.
yeah, sorry, saying
And
something.
fragmentation, I was saying, in education.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm saying, be it education, be it retail, and some other sectors, because India historically has had supply side bottlenecks, which prevented, or GST was not there across states. Forget pan India, across 2 states, it was difficult. So a lot of those bottlenecks are going away, and digitization itself removes inherently a lot of these bottlenecks. So some really large businesses can be built. So extrapolating what we built in offline and saying, okay, online only so much is possible, I think that would be a fallacy. So I think probably some of these global investors are also seeing that those unlocks that digitally big businesses can be built.
Right.
No, and actually on that point, if we go back 10, 12 years ago, Flipkart and Ola had pioneered that cash on cash sort of payment, right?
Yes, correct.
So
correct.
that was a whole innovation required because the payments infrastructure was not there.
Right.
But today, what is happening is you are seeing companies get out the gate with the world's best payment infrastructure available to them. And there is a acceptance of digital payments. It has now become sort of almost to say कि मेरा सच्ची वाला भी UPI ले रहा है, it's like that. So that has penetrated so deeply now, and certain consumer habits have evolved, habits have changed in some cases. So there is it's the perfect Lollapalooza actually, confluence of so many multiplying factors.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point actually you bring up. It's not just the internet penetration, but also the payment penetration, right? Because you can actually make...
How do you transact with it?
Yeah, you can actually monetize all these guys as well. While the domestic market, obviously we've spoken about it, saying, it's huge, right? We're also looking at a breed of businesses that are building for the world, right? You look at EdTech, for example. I personally feel that multi-decacorn businesses could be built in EdTech, right? $20-30 billion types, right? Because India has some of the best teachers in the world, right? And if you can teach someone in Chennai or Bombay, you might as well be able to teach someone in the US or in Europe, elsewhere, right? That is one sector, and of course, I mean, if you look at SaaS companies right now building B2B software and so on, right? They are global from day zero, right? Because they realize that, if we're doing all of this work, might as well get paid in dollars, right? So there is this whole build globally thing that's also happening, which could be very interesting and makes these startups a lot more valuable. So Rajiv, you operate in the early stage space, right? And early stage investments itself have increased. I think in number of deals in 2020 increased by about 14% to 924 deals, right? And we're seeing higher conviction also in early stage investing, right? So contra example to what Nimish mentioned in terms of secondary sales and so on. If you look at Venture Highway, they stayed invested in Meesho all through from angel to whatever they've raised right now, right? And India Quotient is another example. Of course, we had Mr. Anand Lunia on the podcast earlier as well, where they have stayed invested in ShareChat, and both of them have been richly rewarded, right? So, what do you make of the early stage scene in India?
No, so early stage too, Roshan. It's just part of the evolution of the entire private side of the cap table, right? So just as you were talking about on the public side, you've seen the entrance, you've seen the entry of EPFO, you've seen the entry of large number of retail investors. You've seen at every level, at every size, actually on the public side, there have been new players come into the market in the last 5 years, which is the same kind of trend on the private side, where the global sort of capital and global investors writing the big checks obviously make headlines, but there are lots and lots of angel groups that have active ones that have come up. And what Nimish was mentioning earlier in terms of recycling capital, so let's say an early employee or a founder who's exited and sitting on a pile of cash. So then they decide, let me sort of redeploy that into private companies. So that virtuous cycle has, in a way, taken off. And I would sort of, if we trace it back, I would say it probably started with the big Flipkart exit, which turned so many people into millionaires, multi-millionaires.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact,
and actually, those kind of events have also given confidence to domestic capital.
Right.
So you see many IT billionaires who in the last 4-5 years have actually stepped up. So they are becoming LPs in domestic funds. They are creating accelerators. They are themselves angel investors. And in the last 5 years this has happened. If you go back 10 years, they weren't even looking at this side of the fence. That the startup sort of world was just a wild west with sort of no prospects in the eyes of most people, including the sort of IT industry at that time.
Right.
But obviously that I think has really evolved now.
Yeah. No, that's a great point you make, Rajiv. Again, respectable folks like, Mr. Ratan Tata, for example, himself personally angel investing and so on. It lends a lot of credence.
My view is that was a game changer actually. And
Yeah.
we've written about this in our book as well, Roshan.
Yeah.
That Mr. Tata's entrance, Mr. Tata sort of taking this up, it gave a lot of like respectability, credibility to angel investing and to sort of entrepreneurship in India, I think. Before that, people just thought, it's not a serious thing.
Right. So Nimish, Rajiv spoke about some of the second order effects as well, right? In terms of, wealth creation. And by the way, on the Flipkart point, I think I forgot to add, it's not just the employees, but also the sellers, right? I mean, multiple sellers on the platforms making lakhs and if not crores of rupees. And mostly from the hinterlands, right? I mean, these are tier 2, tier 3 cities sourcing their products and services and whatnot. So it's been a fantastic revolution in that sense. So Nimish, talking about the second order effects of some of this stuff, right, which is wealth creation, obviously, and some of this money finding its way back into the startup ecosystem, right? And again, you're seeing people who have been there, done that, starting to invest in startups. So I think it can have that whole multiplier effect in terms of smart capital being deployed, right?
I think, I mean, I'm not sure whether all that capital is smart necessarily. And to be this, and early stage investing, I mean, the really early stage is a lot of hit and miss, right? Pretty much maybe 1 on 10, 2 on 10 successes. But what is more important is for people to have the risk appetite, knowing fully well that your capital will go to zero. Imagine, I mean, India is a country where people used to invest in LIC for in that insurance come endowment thing, where it was the worst investment because at least there was capital protection. From there, in 25 years, we have come to a place where people are okay to deploy 5 lakhs checks, 2 lakh, 3 lakh checks, and prepared for it to go to zero. So I think that's a big mindset change. We are playing to win, playing for big moves rather than protection, capital protection. It's important. I'm not saying capital protection is not important, but I think that's one mindset change definitely has happened. Secondly, Rajiv spoke about it, but a lot of employees, ex-employees or of these unicorns or this wherever they have got an exit, they're almost 70-80% of their capital is being reinvested into either they start their own, so which are in a way it's an opportunity cost, right? So you're reinvesting in that your own business, or you're investing into some friend startup. So clearly the threshold which was needed for starting a company, the capital is no longer a constraint. So that definitely one big second order effect has happened. And second, I think I see this whole revolution, and as an ex-IT analyst, who has tracked a lot of IT stocks and the second order effect on the whole economy at large. I think this current whole startups or technology cycle can have similar, even bigger effect on the overall Indian economy. Because ultimately, you look at Bangalore, parts of Gurgaon, Noida, maybe Hyderabad, Bombay, not so much, where pretty much the entire secondary economy is now being driven by people who are working in startups. So I would expect that to be a big game changer for Indian economy as a whole. I think that's the bigger second order effect than just this capital being reinvested. Third, I think it's more reflective of what's happening in India over the last 10-15 years. You see it in the Indian cricket team. The cricketers are more confident. Today, every 20-something person is so confident, willing to take risks. It's a whole attitude change, and that augurs really well. Yes, but it might sometimes turn into bravado and misplaced confidence, but I think on balance, it's a positive thing. So I think these are the three second order effects that I would look at, and extremely positive. This I would say, and I'm hopeful this continues. But yes, it's most important that the capital flow continues. And it's sexy, right, to work in a startup or start something. That was not the case 10 years back. So we've moved a long way since then.
Believe me, I know, right?
Yeah.
I think 13 years back you had to justify startups to everyone, right? From landlords to your in-laws to everyone, right?
Correct.
And today you
For
have
sure.
like today you have random uncles messaging you about angel investing and how to deploy money, their hard-earned money in startups,
And
right?
even on
So
resumes, it is looked as positively that you're a risk taker. 10 years back, so startup because you probably didn't get a job in a good company. You
Exactly. It was seen as someone doing time pass.
yes. It's a lifestyle entrepreneurship or lifestyle job rather than actual job. So I think it's definitely it has a lot of positives.
right. No, on that note, some of the wider significance also, right? Because earlier again, startups, you would assume that they're lean teams and whatnot, but Swiggy has 8,000 employees today, right? Zomato has 5,000 employees or so. You're seeing that employee base widen, and as businesses are going to get bigger, I mean, you're going to see a wider base of people being impacted and influenced by startups as well. Yeah. So,
For sure. Actually, Roshan, on that point,
yeah.
I was just about to say that many of the companies we think of as startups, they are now pretty significant sized corporates, right? So even their valuations are approaching that level, and the employee base is also approaching that level. Where if they were listed, they would be considered, significant mid caps, and some of them could even get into large cap territory in a few years. So
Yeah, in fact, I think on this point, right, Roshan particularly, I think back in 2007, my good friends Anshu Govil and Bhavtosh Vajpayee back then had written an excellent report called Chain Reactions, which essentially captured the second order effect of Indian IT on the economy. And I would urge all your Bharat Varta listeners to actually, if they get a chance, to get a hold of the copy and read through it. A very beautifully put on what was the second order effect. And that's, I think, we are seeing all that repeating with this whole new startup ecosystem now.
Right. I mean, both of you tend to interact with founders, and I wonder, how all of this has impacted their attitudes. For instance, I mean, I run a podcast, The Startup Operator, and I feel like over the last year, I mean, I've gotten to talk to so many people who I consider super smart, right? The current breed of founders and operators, I don't know if it's because of rising ambitions or the amount of institutional knowledge that is available, right? There is just tremendous ambition, drive, and knowledge, actually, with the current lot that we speak. And yet, I mean, you often sometimes hear about like valuations being out of whack and things to that effect, right? So, how has all of this changed founders, in your opinion? Maybe Rajiv, you can talk, and then Nimish can add.
No, so it is a generational shift, right? So I think 10 years is a long time in any sort of startup sort of ecosystem and for any technology cycle. But the sheer scale of change that's happened in India in 10 years, I would say we've not skipped one, but maybe 2 or 3 generations actually.
Yeah.
So whether it is in terms of just the knowledge, the awareness, the confidence that, let's say, a 22-year-old today who's thinking of starting up has, very different from the 22-year-old 10 years ago. And again, I go back to the point of mental shift. Those of us who've been around for that period, we see the difficulties, they see the possibilities, right? So and they see the possibilities because they've not seen those difficulties, and in some ways that's how progress happens. Someone with a fresh pair of eyes comes in and is not encumbered by baggage of the past, and they just go for it, and enough of them succeed, and then there's a step change.
Right. Yeah, to me, I think, I've had a couple of moments where I've just been stunned, right? I mean, you look at the number of businesses trying to sell to Indian MSMEs right now, right?
Yeah.
Katabook or Razorpay or whoever, who are trying to give this whole business in a box kind of a solution, right? And these could be, now MSMEs itself are such a wide range. It could be a Kirana store, it could be someone running a manufacturing unit of 40-50 people as well, right? So, I always believed it was an anathema to sell to these folks, right? Because Indians never pay for intangibles, yada yada yada, and I think couple of companies had done this well, only couple, right? Tally and then Zoho, right? But then right now, I mean, you have a whole set of startups queuing up to serve this market, and that reflects all of what we are talking about, right? The rising ambitions of people. Unafraid to solve problems which people avoided earlier, right? So Nimish, along with that, there's often this.
I just want to add one point, Roshan, on that MSME bit. So I think earlier people only used to. So when we say MSMEs, we're obviously talking about the formalized MSMEs, right?
Correct.
Earlier, people only saw the cost of formalization. I think in the last year or so, they've also seen the value.
Great point. Yeah.
The value of formalization, where if you're a registered business, and in a crisis of this type that we've seen in the last year, government has made available certain programs, which if you're a formal business, you can access. If you're a non-registered business, how do you access it? So there's the cost of formalization, but there's also a value which people are beginning to see. The value of being able to access credit, the value of being able to access sort of government support in a crisis, the value of in other terms, in sort of tangible terms, actually, it's coming across now that if you stay as a proprietorship or a registered partnership or whatever, any structure like that where you are keeping a records, and the cost of all of that is also coming down, right, because of digitization. So these are all like virtuous cycles kind of reinforcing each other, and it looks like they will only gather more and more steam.
Right. Yeah, formalization also spurred by technology and startups as well, right? The kind of services that are being
very much driving it. Because again, like if you go back 15, 20 years and you tell a business you have to formalize, the sheer cost of formalization will not support that.
Right.
You know, the cost of doing that paperwork and so on and so forth,
Right.
so, will not make that viable, will not enable that at all.
And what do you get in return? You get
what
government
you
officers, you know.
you get a 35-37% tax rate, right?
Exactly.
So why do that? So the business
Exactly.
says, you know, whatever, I'm happy running my show the way I am.
Right.
And now the thing is, you are paying 24-25% tax. The costs are much lower. It's digitized. Credit is much more easily available if you are a formal business. You know, in times of crisis, government extends a hand if you're a formal business, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, and I think that is a game changer, Rajiv, which is that, you know, all of these payment businesses, which will now, you know, start offering lending services, right? I mean, credit access is such a crucial thing, and most of our businesses are credit starved, right? And borrow at unreasonable rates. Now with these startups, you know, focused at that, right, we can actually reward people who formalize and people who run a good business, actually.
Yeah, no, for sure. So all the tax reforms, administrative reforms, you know, the introduction of GST, despite all its kind of issues and problems, along with digitization, has created so many positives, which hopefully India will be able to encash on in the next few years.
Right. So, Nimish, you know, when we talk about startups, there's startups and funding actually. There is often this criticism that, you know, these are go for broke businesses and that they're bleeding money, you know, while chasing growth incessantly and all of that, which to an extent is fair, right? All of them are like, you know, loss making. Most of them are at least, right? But how should one view these businesses? You know, what is the right frame of reference?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. I guess, well, I mentioned in the first part of this conversation that investors have taken a certain leap of faith on market leaders in segments and given certain valuations. Yes, valuations are rich, but if I were an entrepreneur, I would go for it, right? Why would I not take the capital? Right now, the cost of capital is low, there's liquidity. And maybe in many cases, I can guarantee you, having been part of on this side, is on founders also know that it's being overvalued. But if someone is giving me capital at that, I will go and take it. So it's I won't say all the founders are delusional and they believe that this company is valued at that. They're taking it because it's available and they have a solid realization that the business metrics need to really grow to, and the company as a whole needs to grow into that valuation. So that is definitely there. I think yes, and see there are some parallels, right? The onus is on if you see 2015 and 16 when the first this big wave like this in late growth capital happened. I think a lot of companies are in and around those who got growth capital, late stage growth capital at that time. Their valuations haven't grown much. I mean, businesses grew, but valuations haven't. So it's the risk that investors are willing to take, and entrepreneurs will sell that. Why not? So in some cases they break out, but I feel maybe the 10, 12 companies who probably have turned unicorns plus and getting valuation, my belief is maybe 2 or 3 or 4 of these will actually end up really creating disproportionate value even of this base. Others will have to take a pause and maybe some will just fall off. I mean, we have instances where a Snapdeal fell off the radar after being valued at 6.5. But I think that's the nature of the beast. I wouldn't want to overthink on something like this. Right now, so many changes happening. It's very difficult for one investor, even an entrepreneur, to have a crystal ball and say these are the exact 5 things which will work and 5 things won't. So what do investors do? They spread out their investment across a basket of 10 companies. What do entrepreneurs do? They will launch 3 businesses and invest capital behind all 3, maybe hopefully 1 or 2 of them. I think that's the thing that I'm seeing a lot more. Yes, you can say sometimes having a lot of capital does spoil the habits of a company, where there's a DNA of the company, right? If a DNA of the company is built on less capital because it didn't have access, it becomes more disciplined and it can profit. So some of that is a work in progress thing, which a lot of founders will have to wade through. But the whole fundamentals of capital, or the whole philosophy of capital raising, is raise when you can rather than when you want. So right now, all founders can. They are raising capital, uh, knowing fully well that maybe a lot of it is being their own companies are being overvalued, but that's fine. That's the nature of the game. Both sides play it.
So I have a slightly different perspective on that front. Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead, Rajiv. Just to
go
add.
on. I'll go after you.
Right. No, slightly different perspective in the sense that I think founders are a lot more mature than the founders of 5-10 years back. Right. I mean, they know that they will have to play long term games in the ecosystem. Right. I mean, it's not. You can't exit the scene in 10 or 15 years, right? You're going to be here for 30 or 40 or how many ever years you're going to be active, right? So, and they also know that, I mean, the reputation matters, obviously, right? I mean, if you are the kind of founder who's going to take the biggest chunk of the pie and then, not give a good enough exit for your investors, right? The odds of you starting another company or funding others or working with others becomes significantly lesser, right? And I also genuinely feel founders are a lot more ambitious these days and probably believe, I don't want to say believe in the Kool-Aid, but right, but they also truly believe that that much growth is justified, right?
I think Roshan, I just add one before Rajiv steps in, because see, pretty much all, I would say 100% of founders who have reached this stage of billion or whatever, I mean, $1 billion is an artificial benchmark, I feel. They are not here to flip and sell and start a new business.
Right. That's
I
exactly.
can guarantee you that. I mean, they have conviction. Now, that conviction might be misplaced in some cases. In many cases, it might be correct. But they are all in. They are all in to run the businesses, as you say, for the next 15, 20 years to grow it, whatever. So it's not that any of them are giving a story so that they make their money, they flip and go out. That's definitely not the case. But in that process, maybe some might succeed, some might not. So yes, you are right in that sense that there's a personal conviction for pretty much all founders who have passed a certain threshold, and they're playing the game because if it's available, you do it. And maybe today, instead of someone valued at 5, they might think, okay, maybe 4 was fine, but if 5, so it's not that someone thinks I'm valued at 500, but I'm getting at 5 billion. I don't think anyone. That's the extent of the gap. It might be plus or minus 15%, 20%, which is fine. It happens in even public markets all the time. I don't. So that's just the essence of my thought. Yeah, Rajiv, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just saying. Obviously, this varies from sector to sector. Certain industries require upfront capital investment, right? So it makes sense for them to raise when they can. There are other businesses that do not require that kind of continuous infusion. And in fact, some businesses have reached that point now where they are kind of self-funding, including some of the large online brokerages like Zerodha. I think Nitin Kamathi put out this tweet storm saying why he has not raised capital and will not raise capital. And if you look at Zerodha's numbers, actually, it's making a ton of cash every year. So why should they raise capital, right? So they can pretty much fund their growth themselves. So that was one point. And the second point I wanted to make was on the accounting of this, actually, where so certain accounting standards that are legacies of the industrial era, where if you made a capital expenditure, you capitalize that over a period of time. But in a digital business, much of the R&D and advertising that you're doing, which actually you're trying to translate into new users, hopefully they'll be sticky enough, and so on. That is actually falling as an expense straight away to the P&L. So what could be characterized as a capital expenditure is being characterized as an outright expense, and that kind of artificially depresses earnings. So this is true even for public markets investors in like tech companies. If you see Alphabet, if you see Facebook, and look at their income statements, their R&D and so on, everything is being expensed upfront, and yet they are sort of making tons of cash and significant earnings. So this is, I think, a quirk of accounting as well. So I think in that sense, one should think carefully about whether what a business is spending on. whether that is a capital expenditure or whether it's actually an expense.
Right.
Yeah, but having said that, Roshan and Rajiv, of course, I do believe that these businesses will have to demonstrate profitability and grow into this. And India does have a ARPU problem in general, right? I mean, Roshan.
No, so then you just outsource your ARPU problem to the US, right?
Yeah, which is what I think, which is what the edtech companies are doing. I mean, if you speak to them, you will realize that they realize for the same, say someone is paying 500 rupees per hour in India, will be with 1500 per hour in the US. So those things, SaaS businesses, the same thing. So I guess, of course, but all businesses are not in that boat. But yeah, profitability will have to be solved for. But yes, I mean, but I think many of these companies
So in somewhere over a 3 to 5 year period, though that discretionary spending pie will also increase in India, right?
Yeah.
And then certain businesses have that opportunity to look abroad as well for customers. And frankly, that export or internationalization bit is super interesting for Indian companies because you're building for that low ARPU, but then you're able to access customers who are paying like basically Western prices or American or European prices, whatever you want to call it.
And some of these companies are going international very early in the stage. I mean, I was thinking of MPL, Mobile Premier League. They went to Indonesia. Meesho, I think, has an international presence. So a lot of these companies are going international much earlier in their lifestyle cycle rather than waiting to dominate India, then go outside. So I think you will see that trend also emerging to solve for some of the profitability concerns or the ARPU problem that we spoke of.
Right, and so I come from the SaaS world, right? And typically, you've seen valuations rise like beyond 12, 15 times. And you have like amazing examples of companies listing in the US at these crazy valuations as well. Crazy as, conventional, seen through conventional eyes, right? But then you just look at the nature of the business itself and how the SaaS market has grown, right? Now cloud is growing like crazy, right? And by all estimates, it might grow 3x in the coming few years, right? So, so whatever it is your business is, let's say it's X, it goes to 3x in whatever time cloud itself triples, right? And then you see, categories being built for software that was previously, not even unknown, right? Who would have predicted Slack, for example, right? So if you ask me in 2007 or 8, what was Slack's market cap or what they would be bought for? I mean, I would be stretched to even say $1 billion, right? But then got sold for around 27 or $28 billion last year, right? And then you see intrinsically the mechanics of the business itself, right? Things like net retention, for example, in SaaS. Right, you've seen companies demonstrate over the last 10-15 years a net retention of 150%, right? So for every dollar I'm earning today, a year down the line, that dollar becomes $1.5, right? So I think, Rajiv, to your point on accounting, I think there's a lot of metrics that are unique to these startups itself that while fundamentally there is a question of profit and loss, obviously, right, it has to also be viewed in the lens of what they're trying to do, right? Like the higher sort of aims that they're trying to achieve with the capital that they have.
Yeah, and actually the fundamental question, that is the expense a capital investment.
So, final few questions actually. It's been a fascinating podcast and I think we can talk for an hour more, right? This is a very interesting topic. So Rajiv, you touched upon this bootstrapping versus funding sort of a paradigm, right? And in my opinion, I think it's a false dichotomy. There are certain businesses and there are certain founders' temperament which suits more bootstrapped lifestyle, and there are certain others where funding could be the right answer, right?
And also obviously the kind of business that it
kind
is.
of business, exactly. Kind of
Like
business as well.
So for example, in drug development or in medical devices,
Yeah.
there's a need for a certain capex, right? Upfront. You need to spend money upfront when you're
Right.
developing a drug or doing something like that.
Right.
Whereas that's not the case with, let's say, a D2C brand.
Yeah.
Everything requires some investment, but the D2C brand can be built up organically, slowly, right? You don't need to go out all guns blazing and a huge spend upfront. You can sort of develop a product, scale it slowly, keep plowing back your revenues, your earnings into more sort of products, and let the sort of rolling stone gather its own moss, as the saying goes.
Right. And it also majorly depends on the founder's temperament itself, right? I mean, are you the kind of person who's happy to run a lifestyle business, right? And stay invested, for 15, 20 years,
No, but my point is, you can even build a large business
right.
with that approach. I mean, Zerodha is the country's largest broker, right?
Right. Yeah.
Somebody could have dismissed it as a lifestyle business, whatever. Maybe someone could have said 7, 8 years ago it was a lifestyle business. But is it really a lifestyle business? And it's the largest broker in the country. So
no, it also depends on the type. It also depends on the space in which you're operating, as you rightly said.
Yeah, I think it completely depends on that actually. So there is it should be driven by the financing needs of a business.
Right.
And that's always, it's very difficult to generalize on that. Some people say VC is good, VC is bad, PE is bad, growth capital is good, this is bad. I think that really doesn't make any sense to talk like that actually.
Right.
And specifically to see, right, I mean, a lot of businesses, what has consumed capital in India, they're all marketplaces. And the way Indian infrastructure was on the supply side or demand side, it needed a lot of greasing through capital to make it friction free. I mean, Ola, you needed to get all those, convince these drivers to sort of buy cars and attach it to the platform, on customers to wait just in time.
You had to go one step further, right? You had to provide financing, you had to provide a payment mechanism, you had to create the pieces, right? So, and now actually what is different is the payment mechanism is there.
Yes.
The financing partners are there. So it's more of a plug and play
approach. The ecosystem around that has also picked up. So I think that's why a lot of capital has been consumed. I mean, one can compare and say, hey, the ROI on this capital is not as good. But the reality was you are solving fundamentally much tougher problems. GPS didn't work in India very well because most Indian, didn't have 4G. 4G wasn't there properly. So those were like infrastructural problems, and you solved it by putting a bit more capital to grow fast and all that. So it has taken more capital, but those businesses do need. The likes of Zerodha probably, I'm also always wary a bit of when financing or lending businesses consume a lot of capital. I'm a bit worried, tech theory, because they shouldn't. Ideally, I mean, they should consume debt capital. If they consume a lot of equity capital, that way I'm worried. Except for tier requirement, that's more for banks. Capital person.
Yeah, a lending business is a collections business actually.
It is collection and credit business.
Right.
Credit underwriting. Yeah.
Right. So this has been a fascinating conversation, guys, and we've covered many different aspects of the whole fundraise and startup ecosystem. Right. Finally, I think before we end the podcast, I would love to understand in terms of looking at the future, right? So if you were to look at 2021 and beyond, what are some opportunities that you are excited by, and what are you optimistic about? And maybe if you could name a few startups that you would love to personally invest in if possible, and who we should look out for also.
Maybe I will leave the startup names for Rajiv, given that he's an active investor. But as a theme, if you ask me, I think there are 2-3 themes which I feel positive about. One, of course, is D2C brands in general. And you are seeing a lot of capital come in there. See, the kind of marketing development of brands that needs to happen on a digital platform is very different from how it's happened traditionally. And which is where I guess there's an opportunity for D2C brands to emerge. All young people are buying. Demographics are also favoring that buying on primarily online. I think the whole pandemic has accelerated that shift even amongst older people like us. But I guess that's one. So I think that's one segment I would definitely look at. Second segment, I think some action should happen is in digitalization of healthcare. I guess only the e-pharmacy segments has broken out a bit in that you've seen PharmEasy and the likes. Of course, a lot of profit pool is hidden in pharmacy in India, but I guess internal healthcare delivery, none of the digital or the new age companies have emerged, whereas they have emerged elsewhere. So I think definitely there's a lot of friction there, and that few companies could emerge in that segment is one I would watch out for. And third, I feel it's something we've spoken about extensively in this conversation, is anything which is enabling SMEs. I would say more SaaS businesses enabling SMEs, be it in formalization, in lending, or 20 other category management, whatever there is. I think only 1 million out of some 100 million SMEs are online. I was reading some statistics somewhere. So clearly, over the next 10 years, I'm sure that 1 million will, 100 million will also grow, but assuming that 100 million were to remain static, I'm assuming that will go to 50, 60. So that throws up a lot of opportunity for servicing this, or how do you really get them into formalized economy, tech? I think so. Anyone who's enabling different aspects of that. So I would say these are the three broad themes I would watch out for and be more positive in general. Maybe Rajiv.
Any Nimish, any startup IPOs that you would apply for and that you would love to own?
I think one segment which I don't understand, but definitely is Nykaa. I would like to have a look at this whole beauty segment. I think it's an interesting business and really well built. So that's one IPO I would definitely eagerly watch out and look out for. It's a globally, some companies have really created huge market caps in that segment in general. So I feel India is ready to have a big company in that space, and so I'll just wait and watch out how Nykaa is sort of. That's one thing. It's piqued my interest always.
All right, over to you, Rajiv.
No, so some themes I think which are, I mean, there's so much happening, right? So hard to sort of name one or two things, but the entire consumer space actually, I share Nimish's view that like this space is ripe for sort of, I think, explosive growth, because we're going to see discretionary incomes rise, and people are going to be spending more on all kinds of products. So D2C, consumer, these areas are, I mean, it feels like so much has happened, but I think this is just the trailer. There's way more things that are going to be opening up in the next 3, 5, 7 years. Many things we can't even imagine actually right now. And the other area I'm actually really bullish on is the defense space. So in the last 1 year, 1.5 years, there's been a huge push by Indian government to sort of open up defense to private sector. Traditionally, this was really closed off, right? So there was only the big PSUs which were active in that area. But now you're seeing all kinds of private companies coming into it. And I've met a few of them, and the stuff they're working on is truly mind-blowing actually. It's the very best of Indian engineering. Combines our technical talent with that low cost plus technical talent plus quality, the trifecta comes together for a space like defense, which is a completely new sort of territory, sunrise sector. I think you will see some significant sized businesses actually coming out of it, because the same trends that we are seeing in consumer enterprise also happening in this space, right? In defense, like the whole digitization, new kinds of hardware, new kinds of machines are coming actually. So is the stuff of science fiction, and what is really heartening is some of it is happening in India this time. So we aren't just going to be looking at the American companies and thinking, damn, that's amazing. But you will see some of the stuff being built here in India.
Yeah, that's actually something that I am also most excited by. Some of the capital finding its way into research and core sciences and applied sciences also, actually, like defense, for example, right? Because these are folks who had to rely on grants earlier, and I think given the amount of risk capital available, like a 1 to 5 million sort of a range, I think multiple such students, professors, and people innovating in colleges, research institutions, and so on.
It is really incredible what is happening actually.
Yeah, will definitely get funded, and also will find a way to get to market as well, right? Because that has been a key challenge as well for these folks in terms of taking their innovation from the lab to the market. And I think that is a developing space.
Actually, a model like that has been, if the government of India is not working with them,
Yeah,
it's that much more harder to export, right?
right.
So, so if you're able to work with your own government,
Hmm.
it becomes easier to sort of find export markets.
Yeah.
Because obviously these kind of products are, you just can't sell them. You know.
You've seen in Israel, right? Israel has such a huge defense. I mean,
Yeah.
tech startup.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No,
So
and
Israel and even the US obviously traditionally
Right.
always has, and even there too, you're seeing significant sort of, you know, sci-fi level innovation happening now in
Right.
defense.
And some of the policy level measures also, right? Whether it's like Atmanirbhar Bharat or ISRO now, opening its avenues to startups and so on.
Yes.
I think that is hugely promising. One of those fields that will really kick in, I feel. Yeah.
No,
And
no, it's going to be very interesting, and then there too, this aspect of defense research,
hmm,
you know, core sciences R&D, you know, that is what ultimately pushes the ball forward, pushes the country forward.
right,
We all move forward because of that kind of work happening, and it
right,
filters down into other industries, kind of adjacent areas,
right.
and generally there is like a productivity step up.
Right. No, and people, when they see the amount of funding that's going to, let's say, a social commerce app or whatever it is, right? I mean, which are important innovations, of course. Somewhere they kind of feel that, wish more of this money would find its way into research and so on. But it'll happen, right? Obviously, it'll
So it
happen.
is happening.
Yeah.
For good reasons, it didn't happen earlier.
Right.
Some of those problems have been corrected now.
Right.
So, for example, if you look at the biotech and pharma industry,
Right.
so there was that, you know, case in 2012 where the Supreme Court basically put all clinical trials on ice overnight. You know, it was one of those things. The Supreme Court said, you know, we are banning clinical trials because there were some terrible mishaps that happened in some poorly run trials. The court basically banned all the trials in India. That pretty
Right.
much destroyed the industry
Right.
for the next 5-6 years.
Right.
So then in
No.
2019, India notified the new clinical development rules. And now there is a proper framework to run trials in India.
Right. Right.
And earlier this framework didn't exist, or the industry was in limbo, right, for all those years. Now there is a proper framework. You can run trials in India. So when you're running a clinical trial, you need to recruit patients. Patient recruitment is slow and expensive in Western markets. It's much cheaper in India because obviously we have large population, genetic diversity, you know, availability of those who are looking for cures and so on. So now that you have a regulatory framework in place, it's easier to run trials. So can you really blame someone in 2015 for not wanting to do a drug development company? I mean, how the hell will you run a trial? Or if you want to do that kind of company, might as well stay in the Boston or California ecosystem, right?
Right.
Might as well stay in Boston, or might as well stay in San Diego and other hubs.
Right.
Why come to India?
Right. No, and that's
Regulatory problems we solved.
Yeah.
In the same way in defense, we solved that by opening it up to private sector, by giving a chance to new enterprises,
right.
by opening our minds and creating those kind of collaborations between ISRO and new companies, between like the DRDO and other kinds of new companies in defense. So generally, I think there's been a mental sort of change, like a psychological shift, which government bodies have made and are making, which is
Right.
actually really good.
Yeah. No, and this is the sort of innovation curve that you also are seeing in the valley, right? I mean, of course, they started with all of the software and social media and whatever, but then, I mean, valley companies right now are solving for things like nootropics and biohacking and longevity and things to that effect.
It was always the case. Obviously, Silicon Valley has roots that go back almost 50 years.
Right.
And those roots are coming from DoD funding, Department of Defense funding. And the biotech industry was actually born there, right? So in the 1970s,
Right.
is when the first biotech company, Genentech, was seeded by Kleiner Perkins.
Right.
That's how the biotech industry began. So, and obviously the recent memories only of the last maybe 20-25 years, where we think of internet as technology.
Right.
But before that, there was hardware, there was computers. Computer makers were the technology.
Right.
Then from hardware, it shifted to software, from software to services. And services is what we're talking about today, for the most part. But yeah, that's right. I mean, the cyclicality aspect, where, you know, we've gone from hardware, software, services, now going back to like hardware and more hard tech kind of companies, even in Silicon Valley and the US. I think the early stages of that we're seeing in India too.
Yeah. Yeah, the broader point was that all of this capital is definitely going to spread itself into some of these other research and some of the sectors that were formerly ignored.
Definitely.
Couple of other sectors or spaces that I am personally interested in is, of course, SaaS. I think the base of IT talent in India is tremendous, right? And typically over the last 15, 20, 30 years, we've built services companies, but then services companies have had a hard time pivoting to products, right? But now I think there's a template, there's a playbook for how one can do that. And you're seeing these ecosystems emerge in tier 2, tier 3 cities, right? So for example, Coimbatore or Rajkot and places like this, right, where people have built a SaaS product, and there are million plus, 5 million plus sort of companies that are around, right? And I think we have the sort of enabling infrastructure right now, whether in terms of, let's say, credit card payments or the cloud or whatever it is, right? We have those sort of trends that make it possible to build very good businesses in B2B and SaaS. And the third sort of sector I'm really excited by is the delivery sort of business, right? I mean, if you ask me in 2012 or 2013, whenever delivery was first heard, if they would become as big, I mean, I would not have guessed. But then they've thrived on the back of enabling some of these other businesses, right, like Flipkart and so on and so forth. So yeah, these kind of platform businesses that are
Tell the spades and
correct,
dig up the gold rush.
precisely, exactly. So that is something that I'm excited by. So this has been a superb conversation, and very reluctantly I have to bring it to a close. Thank you so much, Rajiv and Nimish, for joining us on Bharat Varta, and look forward to speaking to you sometime soon again.
Thanks, Roshan. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks, Roshan. Thanks a lot, Nimish.
Thank you. Bye.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Bye-bye.